isn't it simply a question of a long enough timeline to say that, you know, ultimately, well, if we go back in terms of, you say that let's call into question the assumption of evolution or development. There has to be a time in which any culture or community, its level of experience was coming into being. Yeah, well, not just today, but I mean, there may have been rises and falls in terms of development, but ultimately, development, we can observe development, and I'm not shutting down the possibility that there may be these historical outliers, these extraordinary peaks of experience, but ultimately, it has to start somewhere, right? Or is that an assumption?
Well, that is a post-Enlightenment assumption, because among other post-Enlightenment assumptions are the assumption of Genesis, of a Genesis. That there is assumption that if you break things into smaller and smaller pieces and get increasingly smaller, eventually you'll find something from which it all comes from. This is a post-Enlightenment assumption. Another post-Enlightenment assumption is the assumption of essences, that things contain essences, and that we can know things by their essences. Now, I'm not saying that either one of these things is wrong or incorrect or bad. But what I'm saying is that these are prejudices, these are assumptions that we bring into these examinations that don't necessarily confirm or conform to what we're looking at. And an example of that is that Indian culture is actually based on the exact opposite of evolution and development. That in traditional Indian culture, we look at the four yugas, for example. We start out at the Satyuga, right, where everything is perfect and everybody's enlightened, and it's the Garden of Eden. And then we progressively fall to lower and lower states of humanity until we're in the end of the Kali Yuga, where we're basically where we almost lose our humanness, and that goes in stark contrast to social Darwinism and to Darwinism in general, with a guru shishya, a guru chela parampara tradition. It's always assumed that the disciple will never come quite up to the level of the guru. So that the further in time you go back, you find gurus of greater and greater knowledge, and as you go forward, as it were, you get lesser and lesser knowledge. So, so when we assume that these clearly post-Enlightenment assumptions are the case, and this is how we're going to analyze and look at material from a different time and a different culture, we are really only looking into a mirror at ourselves. And this is what I want to avoid in this conversation and in this examination and analysis. I know that in my life, in looking at this stuff, I had to confront a lot of this many years ago, and in fact, one of the people that even pushed me in this direction was the Professor Fritz Stahl, who was one of the really great Sanskritist grammarians of the last 40, 50 years in the West, and he encouraged me to, in fact, question the academy, being at the top of the academy himself. So this is one of the things that I feel very necessary to bring to the table before we jump into actually looking at syllables and actually using some of the sutras of Patanjali, looking at the relationship of Patanjali with Panini, and deriving some sort of meaning and application out of all of this. This is the most difficult subject there is, speech. I don't know of any subject that's more difficult than this.
Yeah, brain quietly blown, actually. I'm just sort of digesting the sort of the acceptedness that the Guru Chela thing just loses a bit of steam in each generation, rather than, I always sort of thought that, occasionally at least, like, you know, you open a channel or something and that kind of knowledge power up downloads, and that keeps the whole thing alive. But I'm just sort of reconsidering that.
Well, you see, in Indian tradition, one of the things that I see is that you could take some of the greatest thinkers and gurus and beings, such as Adi Shankara, right? Adi Shankaracharya is arguably the greatest ever Indian philosopher, certainly the greatest commentator on the sacred texts, one of the great reformers of India, and yet he was constantly deferring to his guru. That whatever I know, this is really a small part of what my guru knows, as it were. And this is very consistent with the entire tradition. And in fact, I can take you to a place in Allahabad where the Ganga meets the Yamuna, which is one of our headquarters of our Akhada, called Mojgiri. And in this place, what happened was there was a famous guru who died, and they built him a tomb, and then his disciple was also famous and great, and they built him a tomb that was a little bit higher than his guru's. And what happened was, when it was finished, after a few years, the higher tomb sunk into the earth, right? So it became lower than his guru's, right? So this became a place of great interest for people, so they could see this sort of miracle of tradition reversing the manipulations of man, right? The fallacies of man, of man's hubris, right? Of his ego, his fantasy of greatness. And in fact, it's possible that we can connect that ego, that hubris, that fantasy of greatness with the post-Enlightenment assumption of evolution. Maybe we're not the greatest things that has ever happened to this planet. Maybe that's a possibility. I mean, you would think that if evolution really works, after all these years, you know, we wouldn't take beautiful nature and make it into parking lots and shopping centers. You know, you would think that we would have at least evolved, right, to that place, you know, where we wouldn't do stupid things like that. You know? You would think that we'd get to the place where we wouldn't make stupid wars, and we wouldn't, you know, basically destroy, you know, populations of our own people with television sets.
Well, one of the assumptions.
Yes.
One of the assumptions of developmental thinkers, whether it's Desjardins or Aurobindo or more recently Ken Wilber. These folks, their models allow for both things to co-occur. That is, you can have increased adequacy in terms of development that produces both greater possibility for good and for evil. That is, you can have the parking lots and the famines and the people always
Back. Oh, it's him.
and mortality rates, and in other words, greater development brings both greater possibility and greater pathology.
We're not putting one down to raise the other. We're trying to lay it all out on the table so that we're very careful when we do look at these things. We are aware of our prejudices and our tinted lenses.
This is
got them.
This is the point I'm trying to make.
I'm curious, just on a thought. I'm totally on board with the remove the tinting in the glasses, and I'm wondering. I mean, does this fall into that category that it's one might just say that on a kind of physical science level we're doing okay, like we can manipulate the atom and all that business, but on a spiritual level we're completely messing up, and we haven't really evolved out of kind of like infant stage. Is that would you say that kind of like is just one of these kind of new age assumptions that you just get indoctrinated with? Or I mean, is it actually just kind of simple, like we're actually just doing poorly spiritually, or is that just a whole concept that is part of this whole removing the tint from the glasses?
Well, I think it's something that we have to look at. I think that it's something we have to lay out on the table, and we have to examine this. Let us not establish an ideology in one direction or the other. I'm not saying this is wrong and this is right or vice versa. I'm saying that these are assumptions, and we have to be aware of these assumptions. And as long as we're fully aware of these assumptions and we realize what baggage, what luggage we bring in to an examination and analysis, then we're okay. I'm okay with that. I send you my blessings and my very best wishes, and we'll be communicating during the week. I'll start giving you some more reading material, and see you next week. Adios.
Thank you.